Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something a little different.
Oh, yeah.
It's this editor's column from the Harvard Data Science Review.
Yeah,
And
okay.
it's got me thinking about something that I'm sure we all kind of struggle with,
Hmm.
which is finding that balance between quantitative and qualitative thinking,
Right.
especially in data science.
Yeah.
Now, you might think that data science is all, numbers and algorithms,
Sure.
but this piece is really pushing the idea that there's a whole other layer,
Okay.
like a whole other way of thinking about data science that's all about understanding the context
Mm.
and the meaning behind the data.
That's right. And, it's not even just having like soft skills or something. Like
Yeah.
the editor really argues that this is a whole different way of thinking that's crucial for doing good data science.
Okay, so break this down for me a little bit.
Yeah.
This qualitative sensibility, because the editor actually mentions that even really experienced data scientists can fall into this trap of thinking that data speaks for itself,
Yeah, for sure.
and actually uses this analogy about a novice statistician who thinks that maximum likelihood estimation, or MLE, is as simple as taking averages.
It's kind of like that old saying, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Mm.
We can get so used to our go-to methods that, we kind of forget about all the other tools out there
Right.
that not a statistician, they might get the right answer sometimes.
Mm.
But without understanding the deeper theory behind MLE, they're missing out on the nuances
Right.
and might even end up misapplying it in situations where it's really not appropriate.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's like, thinking that you understand a car just because you can drive it.
Right.
But there's a whole lot more going on under the hood that you need to grasp to, really be a mechanic.
Yeah.
Now, the editor also shares this funny story about a committee arguing over how to best describe machine learning.
Yeah.
Is it an algorithm, is it a model, or is it a function?
And, it sounds kind of like just a bunch of academics just splitting hairs over semantics.
Right.
But what I think is so fascinating is that each of those terms actually highlights a completely different aspect of what machine learning is.
Okay.
So when we call it an algorithm, we're focusing on that step-by-step process, right? Like recipe.
Yeah.
And then when we say model, it kind of emphasizes that representation of the data.
Right.
Like how are we actually trying to map it? And then function is that gets at those mathematical relationships that are at play,
Okay.
like the underlying engine driving it all.
I love that the editor initially just laughed when someone suggested function,
Yeah.
but then had this like aha moment,
Right.
realizing how important that mathematical understanding actually is.
It really underscores why that interdisciplinary thinking is so important.
Yeah.
Even within a field like data science, if we only focus on like one aspect, we risk missing crucial insights that these other perspectives could offer.
Right.
And it also highlights the potential pitfalls of emphasizing just one over the other.
Okay.
For example, if we only think about machine learning as an algorithm, we might end up fixating on just optimizing those steps without really stopping to think about if we're even using the right data,
Right.
or if we're only focused on that function part.
Right.
We might totally overlook with like the ethical implications of how that function is being applied in the real world.
Okay, so how do we cultivate this more well-rounded kind of qualitative sensibility when it comes to working with data?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Because the editor uses a few terms that honestly sound pretty academic to me.
Okay.
Things like interpretivism,
Mm.
abductive reasoning,
Mm.
and reflexivity.
Okay, let's demystify these a little bit.
Okay.
So interpretivism is basically just remembering that data doesn't actually speak for itself.
Right.
We're always imposing some kind of interpretation on it, whether we realize it or not.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that means recognizing that there's no such thing as truly raw data.
Right.
Every single data set is shaped by the way it was collected and the questions that it was designed to answer.
So it's kind of like being a detective.
Yeah.
You don't just look at a fingerprint, in isolation. You have to figure out how it fits into the whole crime scene and what story it tells.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And that's actually where abductive reasoning comes in.
Okay.
It's about generating new explanations based on what we observe and what we already know.
Right.
It's that like aha moment when you suddenly connect all the dots.
Yeah.
And you come up with a possible explanation for why something happened.
Like figuring out who stole the cookies from the cookie jar
Exact.
based on the crumbs on their shirt and the fact that they were suspiciously absent when the jar went missing.
Exact.
Data scientists are basically doing this all the time, right?
Yeah, they are.
But the editor suggests we should be a little bit more systematic about it.
Exactly. Instead of just relying on intuition or gut feeling.
Right. We can use abductive reasoning as a deliberate process. to generate hypotheses and then actually test those hypotheses against the evidence we have.
Yeah.
And that way we're more likely to actually uncover hidden patterns and avoid just jumping to conclusions.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got interpretivism for understanding context, abductive reasoning for coming up with explanations.
Yeah.
What about this reflexivity thing?
Okay.
Because honestly, it kind of sounds like staring at your reflection for too long.
Well, in a way it is.
Okay.
Reflexivity is about turning that critical lens inward and examining our own biases.
Okay.
Asking ourselves how my own assumptions or, my experiences or even my relationships be influencing how I'm approaching this data. What blind spots might I have?
So it's kind of like a reality check to make sure we're not letting our own preconceived notions like warp how we're seeing the data.
Exactly. And it's crucial because we all have biases.
Yeah.
It's part of being human. But by being aware of them, we can actually try to mitigate their influence and strive for more objective, data-driven insights.
So instead of pretending that we're, perfectly neutral,
Right.
we just acknowledge that we're coming at this data, with our own baggage.
Yeah.
And try to unpack that baggage so that it's not clouding our judgment.
Right. And it's not about beating ourselves up for having those biases either. It's
Right.
about constantly checking ourselves and making sure that they're not leading us astray.
Now, this next part is where things get really interesting for me because the editor asks this very provocative question. Are quantitative and qualitative thinking really that different? Or is it more about the level of resolution we're working with?
It's such a brilliant insight, and I think it challenges the traditional dichotomy between these two approaches.
Yes.
Think about it. Quantitative methods are great for spotting trends and patterns. When you have a lot of data, you can crunch numbers, run regressions, and see what emerges. But when you're dealing with a really unique case, a small data set or something that defies easy categorization, those methods might fall short.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between looking at a satellite image of a forest and actually walking through it on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
The satellite image gives you the big picture, but you miss all the individual trees,
Right.
the undergrowth, all the subtle variations in the ecosystem.
Exactly. And that's where qualitative approaches can really shine.
Yeah.
They allow us to zoom in on those high-resolution details.
Okay.
To understand the nuances and complexities that quantitative methods just might completely miss.
The editor gives this example of an astronomy study
Yeah.
where the researchers only had 3 groups to work with.
Oh, wow.
It's like trying to map the entire galaxy based on observations of 3 stars.
Exactly. With such a small sample size, traditional statistical methods might not be very helpful at all. But by carefully considering the context of each of those 3 groups, those researchers were still able to actually draw some meaningful conclusions.
It's like that saying, one person's noise is another person's signal.
Yeah.
What might just look like random variation in a large data set could actually be crucial information when you're dealing with a small number of cases.
And this is why the editor really argues that the future of data science hinges on weaving together both of these quantitative and qualitative thinking. It's not about just picking one over the other.
Right.
It's about recognizing their strengths and their limitations and knowing when to use them strategically.
So it's not a competition, it's a collaboration.
Exactly.
Each approach bringing something valuable to the table.
Right.
And the editor dives into some really fascinating examples of how this integration can play out, in real-world research.
Yeah, one example that really stood out to me was the development of these interactive data visualizations.
Oh, cool.
These visualizations go beyond just presenting data in a static chart or graph.
Yeah.
They allow users to really explore the data from all these different angles, to drill down into specific details, and even to manipulate the data to see how those different variables interact.
So instead of just passively consuming information, you're actively engaging with it. Asking your own questions and forming your own interpretations.
Exactly. It allows for both quantitative and qualitative understanding.
Right.
You can see the overall patterns and trends, but you can also zoom in and actually examine individual data points.
Okay.
Consider the context and develop your own narratives about what the data is telling you.
It's like the difference between reading a travel guide and actually exploring a new city on your own.
Yeah.
The guide gives you some basic information, but it's the exploration that really brings the place to life.
Absolutely. And another area where this integration is happening is actually in architectural design.
Okay.
So researchers are using algorithms to automatically generate floor plans. But they're doing it in a way that takes into account individual preferences and aesthetic considerations.
So it's like having an AI assistant that can help you brainstorm different layouts and designs,
Right.
but it doesn't dictate the final outcome. You
Exactly.
still get to bring your own creativity and vision to the process.
It's a partnership between human and machine,
Right.
each contributing their unique strengths. So the algorithm can handle those technical aspects like ensuring structural integrity and optimizing space,
Right.
while the human architect can bring the artistic flair,
Mhm.
the understanding of human needs, and that ability to make those subjective judgments about what feels right.
That's such a cool example of how technology can actually augment human capabilities instead of just replacing them.
Yeah.
And speaking of human capabilities, the editor also talks about the really crucial role of communication in data science.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just be able to crunch those numbers and build those models.
Right.
We also have to be able to communicate our findings effectively to a wider audience. And that means being clear and concise and really tailoring our message to the specific audience we're trying to reach.
It's like that classic writing advice, know your audience.
Yeah.
A technical report for a group of statisticians is going to look completely different
Right.
from a presentation you're giving to a board of directors.
Absolutely. And the editor shares this anecdote from their time on a task force for the American Statistical Association.
Okay.
And they realized how even subtle differences in wording could significantly impact how their message was being interpreted.
So it's not just about what you say, but how you say it.
Exactly. And that's especially important when we're communicating these complex data-driven findings to people who might not have a background in statistics or data science.
Yeah.
We have to be able to explain things in a way that's both accurate and understandable
Right.
without oversimplifying or resorting to just a bunch of jargon.
I'm starting to see a theme here. Context, interpretation, communication.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like this qualitative sensibility isn't just some add-on to data science. It's woven into the very fabric of the field.
You're getting it. And this brings us to the question of how we train the next generation of data scientists
Yeah.
to think in this really integrated way.
Right.
The editor proposes what they call a portfolios approach to data science education.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this portfolios approach.
It goes beyond just teaching the technical skills like coding statistics, machine learning,
Right.
and it encourages students to develop those so-called soft skills, which, in light of our deep dive,
Yes.
we might call qualitative skills. Things like communication, collaboration, and critical thinking.
So it's recognizing that being a good data scientist isn't just about, being a technical whiz.
Exactly.
It's about being a well-rounded thinker and communicator.
Right, and the portfolios approach encourages students to demonstrate these skills by showcasing their work in a variety of formats.
Okay.
Not just technical reports, but presentations, blog posts, even creative projects.
Yeah.
This helps them develop their ability to explain these complex concepts to different audiences and to use data to tell compelling stories.
That's a really refreshing take on data science education.
Yeah.
It recognizes that data isn't just about crunching numbers.
Right.
It's about using data to inform decisions, to persuade, to inspire.
And to do that well,
Yeah.
you need both quantitative and qualitative skills.
So it seems like this happy marriage of quantitative and qualitative thinking
Yeah,
is less about like a perfect union
right.
and more about a dynamic partnership where both sides bring something essential to the table.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that data science is a fundamentally human endeavor and that human judgment, creativity, and those ethical considerations are just as important as the technical aspects.
This deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
As we move into the next part of our conversation, let's delve deeper into some of these fascinating examples of how quantitative and qualitative thinking are being integrated in all these different fields.
Sounds good. One of the examples the editor brings up that really stuck with me was the use of data in understanding and shaping urban environments. It's a field where this integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking is becoming super important.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
How is data being used to understand cities in this more holistic way?
Well, think about all the data that's constantly being generated in a city, right? You've got traffic patterns, energy consumption,
Right.
public transportation usage, crime statistics, even social media activity.
Wow, yeah.
And traditionally, all this data might have been analyzed in these silos with different departments just focusing on their specific areas.
Okay.
But what if we could bring all that data together and look at it through both a quantitative and qualitative lens?
I can see how that would paint a much richer picture of what's actually happening in a city.
Right.
You'd be able to see not just the raw numbers, but also the stories behind those numbers.
Exactly. For instance, imagine you're trying to improve public transportation in a city. You could analyze ridership data to see, which routes are the most popular and where there are gaps in service. But that's only part of the story.
Right.
To really understand how people are experiencing public transportation, you'd also need to consider qualitative factors.
Okay.
Things like safety, accessibility, comfort, even like the perceived aesthetic appeal of different routes.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
You could have two bus routes with like similar ridership numbers,
Right.
but one might be consistently overcrowded while the other is more comfortable and enjoyable to ride.
Exactly. And that's where qualitative data can come in.
Okay.
You might conduct surveys, interviews, focus groups to gather feedback from riders about their experiences. You could even use social media data to see what people are saying about different routes and transportation options.
Oh, well, yeah.
And by combining this qualitative data with that quantitative ridership data,
Right.
you get a much more nuanced understanding of the situation and can make more informed decisions about how to actually improve the system.
So instead of just focusing on like efficiency and cost effectiveness, you're also considering the human element, like how people actually feel about using public transportation.
Right. And this approach can be applied to a whole range of urban planning challenges, from reducing traffic congestion to improving public safety to creating more livable and sustainable communities.
It's like the difference between managing a city like a machine and nurturing it like a living organism.
I love that.
You need to understand both the mechanics and the soul of the place.
Exactly. And this idea of understanding the soul of a city really ties in with another fascinating example the editor brings up:
Okay.
the use of data in cultural heritage preservation.
Okay.
Think about all the historical buildings, artifacts, and traditions that make up a city's cultural identity. These things can't be easily quantified or measured, but they're essential to the character and the vibrancy of a place.
So how can data play a role in preserving something that's so intangible?
It's about using data to tell the stories of these places and objects,
Okay.
to make them more accessible to a wider audience, and to engage people in their preservation.
So it's not just about archiving data, it's about using data to create a sense of connection and meaning.
Exactly. For instance, imagine you're working on a project to preserve a historic neighborhood that's facing gentrification.
Okay.
You could collect quantitative data on things like property values, demographics, architectural styles,
Right.
but you could also gather qualitative data
Okay.
through oral histories, community workshops, even photo and video documentation
Wow.
to capture the lived experiences of the people who call that neighborhood home.
So you're not just preserving the physical structures,
Right.
you're also preserving the memories, the
Yeah.
stories, and that sense of community that make that neighborhood unique.
Exactly. And this data can then be used to create interactive exhibits, online platforms, even augmented reality experiences
Wow.
that allow people to explore the neighborhood's history and culture.
It's like bringing the past to life through data.
Right. And it's not just about the past either. Data can also be used to understand how people are currently using and interacting with cultural heritage sites and to identify potential threats to their preservation.
So you could use data to track things like foot traffic patterns, social media mentions, even environmental conditions to see which sites are the most popular, which ones might be at risk of damage, and how people are experiencing these spaces.
Exactly. And this data can then be used to inform decisions about how to manage and protect these sites,
Okay.
how to make them more accessible and engaging, and even how to adapt them to changing needs and conditions.
This is really making me rethink the role of data in our lives.
Yeah.
It's not just about numbers and algorithms.
Right.
It's about understanding the world around us in all its complexity and richness.
That's the key takeaway.
Yeah.
Data can be a really powerful tool for understanding not just the what, but also the why and the how of the human experience. And by embracing both quantitative and qualitative thinking, we can unlock even greater insights and possibilities.
Well said. All this talk about understanding the human experience through data has me thinking about another example from the editor's column:
Okay.
the use of data in healthcare.
Yeah.
It's a field where the stakes are incredibly high
Yeah.
and where the integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking seems absolutely crucial.
You're absolutely right. Healthcare is a perfect example of a field where data is already playing like a transformative role,
Yeah.
but where there's still so much more potential to be unlocked by incorporating more of those qualitative insights.
So how are those two approaches being integrated in healthcare right now?
Okay.
And what are some of the challenges and opportunities?
Well, on the quantitative side, we've seen tremendous advances in using data to diagnose diseases,
Hmm.
to develop new treatments, even to predict patient outcomes.
Yeah.
We have electronic health records, wearable sensors, genomic sequencing,
Right.
all generating massive amounts of data that can be analyzed to identify patterns and trends.
It's incredible how much data we now have at our fingertips.
It is.
But I can also see how it would be easy to get lost in the numbers and lose sight of the human beings behind those data points.
Exactly. And that's where that qualitative side comes in.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the patient's experience, their values, their preferences, their fears and anxieties.
Mhm.
It's about recognizing that every patient is unique and that a treatment plan that works for one person might not be appropriate for another.
So it's about moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare
Right.
and towards a more personalized and patient-centered model.
Precisely. And this is where qualitative research methods like interviews, focus groups, and ethnographic observation can be so valuable.
Okay.
By talking to patients, listening to their stories, and observing their behaviors,
Right.
we can gain insights that would never be captured in a spreadsheet or a statistical model.
I can see how that would be particularly important in areas like mental health,
Yeah.
where the diagnosis and treatment are often very subjective and depend heavily on the patient's self-reported experiences.
Absolutely. And even in more objective areas of medicine like cardiology or oncology,
Right.
qualitative data can provide crucial context and nuance.
Right.
For instance, imagine you're a doctor trying to decide whether to recommend a particular surgery to a patient.
Hmm.
You might have all the quantitative data on the risks and benefits of the procedure,
Right.
but you also need to consider the patient's individual circumstances,
Okay.
their support system, their financial situation, and their personal values and beliefs.
That's like the difference between treating a disease and caring for a person.
Exactly. And that's why the integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking is so essential in healthcare.
Yeah.
It allows us to move beyond just treating symptoms and towards providing truly holistic and compassionate care.
So it sounds like healthcare is a field where this happy marriage of quantitative and qualitative thinking is already starting to blossom, but where there's still a lot of room for growth and innovation.
Absolutely. And I think this is where data scientists, with their expertise in both quantitative and qualitative methods, play a really crucial role in shaping the future of healthcare.
It's exciting to think about the possibilities.
Yeah.
As we've been discussing these different examples, I've been struck by how this integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking seems to lead to this richer,
Right.
more nuanced, and ultimately more human-centered approach to problem solving.
I completely agree. It's about recognizing that data is not just a collection of numbers. It's a reflection of human experiences, behaviors, and interactions. And by incorporating both quantitative and qualitative perspectives, we can unlock a deeper understanding of those experiences and create solutions that are more effective, more equitable, and more aligned with human values.
Well said, and this brings us to another fascinating application of this integrated approach that the editor highlights.
Okay.
The world of education.
Yeah.
It's a field where data has become increasingly prevalent,
Right.
but where there's also been a lot of debate about how to use it effectively and ethically.
That's right. Education is a field where data can be so powerful, but it's also a field where we need to be especially mindful of the potential consequences of how we collect, analyze, and interpret that data.
So what are some of the ways that quantitative and qualitative data are being used in education today?
Okay.
And what are some of the ethical considerations we need to keep in mind?
Well, on the quantitative side, we've seen a growing trend towards using data to measure student performance,
Okay.
track progress, and identify areas where students might be struggling. We have standardized tests, online learning platforms, even student information systems that generate massive amounts of data that can be analyzed to identify patterns and trends.
This kind of data can be helpful for identifying students who might need extra support
Yeah.
or for seeing which teaching methods are most effective.
Right.
But I can also see how it could be really easy to fall into the trap of reducing students to a set of numbers and ignoring their individual needs and circumstances.
Exactly. And that's where that qualitative side comes in again. It's about understanding the whole child, their strengths, their challenges, their learning styles, their motivations,
Right.
their home environment, and all those other factors that contribute to their educational experience.
So it's about moving away from a narrow focus on just test scores
Mm-hmm.
and towards a more holistic view of student development.
Precisely. And this is where qualitative research methods like classroom observations, student interviews,
Yeah.
parent surveys, and even student portfolios can be incredibly valuable.
Okay.
By gathering data from all these different perspectives, we can create a more complete and nuanced picture of each student and tailor our teaching approaches accordingly.
It's like the difference between assessing a student's knowledge and understanding their learning journey.
Exactly. And this is why that integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking is so crucial in education.
Hmm.
It allows us to move beyond just measuring outcomes and towards creating learning environments that are engaging, supportive, and truly personalized.
I love that idea of creating learning environments that are truly personalized.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a key theme that keeps emerging in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of recognizing individual differences and tailoring our approaches accordingly.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the most powerful insights that comes from embracing both quantitative and qualitative thinking.
Yeah.
It allows us to see beyond the averages, the trends, the generalizations, and to really appreciate the unique tapestry of human experiences and perspectives.
Well said.
Mm.
As we've been talking about all these different examples, I've been thinking about the editor's argument that the future of data science depends on weaving together these two ways of thinking.
Right.
It's not about choosing one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's about recognizing their strengths and limitations and using them in concert to create a more complete and nuanced understanding of the world around us.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I think this integration is already happening in many fields, from
Yeah.
healthcare to urban planning to education.
Right.
But there's still so much potential to be unlocked.
So how can we encourage more people to embrace this integrated approach?
Okay.
And what are some of the challenges we might face along the way?
Well, one challenge is that our education system often reinforces the divide between quantitative and qualitative thinking.
Yeah.
We tend to separate subjects into these neat categories like math and science versus English and history.
Right.
But in the real world, these disciplines are interconnected,
Mm.
and we need to be able to draw on both ways of thinking to solve these complex problems.
So we need to start breaking down those silos and encouraging students to see the connections between different disciplines.
Exactly. We need to create more interdisciplinary learning experiences
Okay.
where students have the opportunity to apply both quantitative and qualitative methods to real-world challenges.
That's a great idea.
Yeah,
It's like teaching students to be bilingual,
right.
fluent in both
So-
the language of numbers and the language of stories.
I love that analogy. And it's not just about formal education either. We also need to create more opportunities for people to develop these skills outside the classroom
Okay.
through workshops, online courses, mentorship programs, and even just by encouraging people to be more curious and observant in their everyday lives.
It's about fostering a culture of lifelong learning
Yeah,
where people are constantly seeking new knowledge and perspectives.
exactly. And I think this is where the power of storytelling can be so valuable.
Okay.
We need to find ways to share the stories of people who are successfully integrating quantitative and qualitative thinking in their work.
Mhm.
We need to showcase the impact that this approach can have in solving real-world problems.
It's about showing people that this isn't just some abstract academic concept.
Right.
It's a way of thinking that can make a real difference in the world.
Absolutely. And by sharing these stories, we can inspire others to embrace this approach and to see the world through this richer, more nuanced lens.
I'm feeling so inspired right now. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. As we wrap up this part of our conversation, let's shift our focus to the practical implications of integrating quantitative and qualitative thinking.
Okay.
What are some specific examples of how this approach is being applied in different fields, and what are some of the lessons we can learn from those examples? As we've been talking about all these different examples, it's really striking how this integration of quantitative and qualitative thinking seems to be popping up everywhere. But it also makes me wonder, are there any fields where this kind of blended approach is particularly challenging or maybe even hasn't quite caught on yet?
That's a great question, and it really gets at the heart of how different fields value different types of knowledge.
Yeah.
One area that comes to mind is economics.
Okay.
Traditionally, economics has been very much a quantitative field focused on mathematical models, statistical analysis, and these large-scale data sets.
That makes sense.
Yes.
I mean, we talk about the economy in terms of numbers all the time. GDP, inflation, unemployment rates.
Right.
It seems like a natural fit for a quantitative approach.
Exactly. And those quantitative methods have been incredibly valuable for understanding economic trends, forecasting growth, and developing policies.
Hmm.
But there's this growing recognition that relying solely on those methods can lead to a somewhat narrow and, some might argue, incomplete understanding of how economies actually work.
So what's missing from that picture? Where does the qualitative side come in?
Well, for one thing, economics is ultimately about human behavior.
Right.
It's about how people make decisions, how they interact with each other, and how those choices and interactions shape markets and societies.
Okay.
And those are things that can't always be captured in a neat mathematical equation.
It's like trying to understand a painting by analyzing the chemical composition of the paint.
Mm-hmm.
You might learn something about the materials,
Right.
but you're missing the artistry, the emotion, the story that the painting is trying to tell.
That's a great analogy, and that's where qualitative methods like interviews, focus groups, and ethnographic observation can be incredibly valuable in economics. They allow us to explore the motivations, beliefs, and values that drive economic behavior,
Hmm.
the social and cultural contexts in which those decisions are made,
Right.
and the unintended consequences of policies that might look good on paper but don't quite work out in practice.
So it's about understanding the human stories behind the economic data.
Exactly.
And are there economists who are actually doing this kind of work?
Absolutely. There's a growing field of behavioral economics which draws on psychology and sociology to better understand how people make economic decisions.
Okay.
And there's also a growing interest in incorporating qualitative methods into more traditional economic research to get a more grounded and nuanced understanding of economic phenomena.
It sounds like economics is starting to embrace this more integrated approach, even if it's still facing some resistance from those who see it as a departure from the rigor of quantitative methods.
That's right. It's a shift in perspective that can be challenging for any field.
Yeah.
But I think it's a necessary one if we want to develop a more complete and accurate understanding of the complex systems we're studying.
And speaking of complex systems,
Yeah.
another field that comes to mind when I think about the challenges of integrating quantitative and qualitative thinking is climate science.
Absolutely. Climate change is arguably one of the most complex and pressing challenges facing humanity today.
Right.
And it's a challenge that demands both rigorous scientific analysis and a deep understanding of human behavior and social systems.
So how are climate scientists using both quantitative and qualitative approaches to address this challenge?
Well, on the quantitative side, we have these incredibly sophisticated models
Mm-hmm.
that allow us to project future climate scenarios, track changes in temperature and sea level,
Right.
and understand the complex interactions between the atmosphere, oceans, and land.
Okay.
And this data is absolutely crucial for informing policy decisions and developing mitigation and adaptation strategies.
But it's not enough just to understand the science, right? We also need to understand how people are perceiving and responding to climate change and how we can motivate collective action to address this global crisis.
Exactly. And that's where the qualitative side comes in.
Okay?
We need to understand people's beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to climate change. We need to explore the cultural and political factors that influence those beliefs and behaviors.
Right.
And we need to find effective ways to communicate the science in a way that resonates with people and inspires them to act.
That sounds like a tall order. How are climate scientists actually incorporating these qualitative insights into their work?
Well, one way is through these interdisciplinary collaborations with social scientists, communication experts,
Okay.
and even artists and storytellers.
Wow.
So they're conducting surveys and interviews to understand public perceptions of climate change.
Okay.
They're studying how climate change is portrayed in the media and popular culture.
Interesting.
And they're developing innovative ways to communicate the science in a way that's engaging, accessible, and emotionally resonant.
So it's about going beyond just presenting the facts and figures and finding ways to connect with people on a deeper level.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that climate change is not just a scientific issue, it's a human issue.
Mm-hmm.
And addressing it effectively requires this holistic approach that takes into account both the scientific complexities and the human dimensions of the challenge.
Well, this deep dive has certainly opened my eyes to the power and potential of integrating quantitative and qualitative thinking. It's a way of approaching the world that seems both more comprehensive and more human-centered.
I agree, and I think it's an approach that's becoming increasingly essential in a world that's growing ever more complex and interconnected.
So as we wrap up this fascinating conversation, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will hold on to?
I think the most important thing is to remember that data is not just a collection of numbers. It's a reflection of human experiences, behaviors, and interactions. And by embracing both quantitative and qualitative thinking, we can unlock a deeper understanding of those experiences and create solutions that are more effective, more equitable, and more aligned with human values.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this fascinating world of data and the human stories it holds.